I would like to introduce your guide today, Ann Romney, who is well known here at the library and well loved, and who is a volunteer with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire and an active Seacoast NAACP member. So I'm going to turn it over to her and to your speakers, and I hope you have a fabulous time.
Thank you. So welcome again, everybody. I am so glad that you're here. This is the second of our series. This is called Bringing It Back, which focuses on conversations the community still needs to have. So we're going to keep having these conversations today and for the next 5 weeks or 4 weeks and forever after that as well. So if you did join us last week, we had an in-depth conversation about history, how it's told, how we tell our history. If we started with the story of the indigenous Americans and Africans on this land before European contact, it's a different story, and that's what we heard a bit about last week. Today's conversation will explore our educational system, which means a lot to so many of us here in this room. And specifically in New Hampshire, 1 year after the Divisive Concepts Law has been in place. We hope that you will engage fully in the conversation when we open the floor after our panelists present and have an opportunity for some questions and answers together. So we look forward to that piece. If you're joining us virtually, please put your questions in the chat. We'll make every effort we can to address as many of them as we can. Today's event is made possible by our sponsors, Revision Energy, the Justice Seekers with St. John's United Methodist Church in Dover, and the Portsmouth Public Library, who has for years hosted us. The series is also brought to you by a grant from the New Hampshire Charities, and also Whole Foods has just recently given us our treats, our cookies, and they will be doing that throughout the rest of the series, which is shout out to them, which is great. So now to begin our program, we have an amazing panel, which our state senator, David Waters, is going to be our moderator, and he's going to take it from here. It's also a Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire board member. So thank you, David.
Well, thank you so much, and it's great to see everybody here for the tea talk and on the paradox of education for Black and brown children. Carter G. Woodson founded Negro History Week in 1926, almost a centennial. He saw the necessity because Black history was being purposefully expunged from American history. And he wrote, "It is not so much a Negro History Week as it is a history week. We should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but history of the world, void of national bias, race hatred, and religious prejudices." This original idea was expanded in the 1970s to become Black History Month, and again after 2013 with the Black Lives Matters movement to more directly challenge institutional racism, not just in history and in schools, but in all aspects and structures of American life. Well, today we're here for conversation about our nation, our state, but more particularly about our communities, our schools, our children. It has been a year since New Hampshire legislators joined a wave of states across the country to pass laws prohibiting teaching critical perspectives on histories, laws, social practices, and literature that have excluded opposing voices and histories of African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and people of color. And, I would guess I'd say there's a new kind of intersectionality among white supremacists, because now we're seeing bills about LGBTQ plus and bills like House Bill 514, supposedly about obscenity, as a way of attacking all of these groups and these teachings. So it is a time for conversation. For this panel, presenters will discuss the effect of these divisive concepts laws have had on teaching, excluded perspectives in their classroom, with a particular focus on New Hampshire. The panel will also explore the paradox of an educational system based on the notion of socializing young people into the existing structure of society, while also claiming to have as its core mission the goal of teaching students to be critical thinkers. Well, we're joined today by Judy DeRosier, who's currently a PhD student in the Teaching of Social Studies program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research centers Afro-American immigrant youth and their experiences with Blackness and other in American schools. Currently, she is the Equity and Inclusion Project Manager for Manchester School District and a research fellow for the Center on History and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. More recently, she works with Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire on school program and curricula. We also have Erin Bakkom, no stranger to many folks here in Portsmouth and certainly in Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. She's president of the Association of Portsmouth Teachers and has, go Union, and has taught 8th grade history at Portsmouth Middle School for 22 years. She has a master's degree in curriculum and instruction from Chapman University. She earned her undergraduate degree from Northern Arizona State University and focused on social sciences and secondary education. Erin has been involved with several projects for the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, including the curriculum to accompany the film Shadows Fall North. And Sarah Robinson is the Education Justice Campaign Director for Granite State Progress. Sarah is a graduate of New Hampshire Public Schools and received her undergraduate degree at New England College in Henniker, New Hampshire. Sarah works for the Concord chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice that she helped establish in 2015. Previously, Sarah acted as the senior project manager for Reaching Higher New Hampshire, where she gained intimate knowledge around education policy and focused on community engagement. She's an alumni of 2021 cohort of Leadership New Hampshire and co-chair of the NAACP's Education Committee. Now, for those in the room, I'm looking around who remember Eleanor Williams Hooker, and I think there are a few of us, she liked people to talk. And so what we're going to do is after our brief presentations is we're going to have a few, 5 or 10 minutes for you all to talk among yourselves together, both in person and online, with some question prompts, and I hope that will spark a more engaged conversation so it truly becomes a tea talk. So, Judy, you're up.
Judy. Surprise. Hello, everyone. In the United States, social studies education provides students with democratic values in hopes they will become informed and civically engaged. However, not all students are represented in the K-12 curriculum. If the aim is to encourage students to become civic-minded, the curriculum needs to address the issues around diversity and inclusion. Social studies is a living field, constantly being pushed to change and evolve to reflect the present society. Contemporary research and scholarship in social studies education include debating critical issues around social change that raises questions about diversity and inclusion. For instance, Dr. Cleo Cherry-Holmes, author of What to Teach, acknowledges that there are constant contentions about what and how to teach within the social studies field. Also, there is a need to accept that teachers can choose how they will respond to the question of what to teach in their classrooms. Similarly, Dr. Leela Abu-Lugad, in the article, Do Muslim Women Need Saving?, asserts that while teachers respond to the what to teach question, she encourages them to teach social studies as a perpetual state of conflict and to move away from the good versus evil paradigms, which is a limiting scope for understanding history. Even so, there are still concerns around what and how to teach social studies. Pulling from Dr. Spivak, who talks about the oversight of most Western cultures ignoring the plight of the other in an effort to support Western economic and political interests. It's believed that the field of social studies already does not pay enough attention to matters of race, ethnicity, and gender, nor does it do enough to question how those issues play up against the dominant notion about what it means to belong, both as identity and citizenship for our students. The paradox of education for Black and brown students living in New Hampshire is fraught at the very least and violent at the most, due to the divisive concepts law. As it's written, the law places restrictions, albeit in a nuanced way, on the capacity of school staff to teach about race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or any other protected class of people, by asserting claims that any group of people in those categories is inherently inferior to another, or that any group outside of these is superior to another. The issue is that the dominant narratives currently taught in schools and the current state of social studies curriculum already centers whiteness, European and European Americans, because those histories are what is primarily taught in schools around the country. Consequently, because the curriculum already excludes people of color in its histories, by inserting the divisive concepts law, it sets the stage to prohibit any more efforts to diversify the curriculum, which is white-centered, with its stories and epistemologies, or ways of knowing. This would mean that students of color are automatically neglected and ignored by the curriculum to prevent them from exploring what it means to be a new American as they forge their identities and examine what it means to be a citizen using the curricula. The curriculum already teaches with the assumption that one group of people is superior to the other because by default it excludes stories, narratives, and histories that are outside of whiteness and the white gaze. The premise then is that whiteness, European and European American histories are more important than others. So the othering, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, and other marginalized groups' experience still exists within the current curriculum. Therefore, anti-racist curriculum is essential to help remedy the dangers of the law. Historically, social studies education perpetuates dominant narratives in the curriculum that have either ignored BIPOC's experiences, perspectives, and contributions, or the narratives taught in the classroom center on white culture and history that support a white savior storyline and continue to push damaging misunderstandings and mistruths about students of color, which essentially help to propel the creation of messianic master narratives. Dr. Ashley Woodson writes in the article, "We're just ordinary people, messianic master narratives and Black youth's civic agency," that messianic master narratives are dangerous for students of color because it positions an individual as the messiah or savior to deliver an oppressed group. Many teachers understand anti-racist social studies education to be a mere adding of popular selected topics of people of color's histories and epistemologies into the current curriculum, whether learned from their own schooling or from their teacher education program. I caution teachers to think about their selections when teaching social studies and in the humanities. Mere content and selected topics integration are still an inadequate step in helping to provoke a conscious effort to include anti-racist education within social studies curriculum. And still, what is largely missing among these discussions about how to study history and historical understanding is the direct incorporation of anti-racist social studies education, because it helps to challenge the long-standing dominant narratives and contest notions about the exclusion of people of color within the curriculum. The following are some suggestions from scholars on how to further improve anti-racist social studies education, despite New Hampshire's divisive concepts law. Doctors Brown and Awe, authors of Race, Memory, and Master Narratives, a critical essay on U.S. curriculum and history, and Dr. Garrett King's article, Teaching Education, Learning Other People's History, a pre-service teachers developing African-American historical knowledge. They both surmise that specific steps need to be taken in order for anti-racist education to successfully challenge the long-standing views of social studies curriculum. And I would add New Hampshire's divisive concepts laws. Dr. Ashley Woodson writes for us to be cautious and mindful of the ways in which people of color experiences and epistemologies are taught when trying to incorporate their perspectives. Dr. Woodson determined that the chosen topics of history that are taught in social studies classrooms can become messianic if it is staged to represent the struggle that shows an exceptional individual as the progenitor of a movement. And that is merely one myth of master narratives because it portrays a reality that reinforces white supremacy, meaning that when selecting and teaching people of color's knowledge and experience as a part of anti-racist education, Educators must be aware of how this knowledge is taught because of the concern of messianic narratives. Otherwise, teachers risk cherry-picking curricula that integrate anti-racist education into the social studies curricula. However, it omits the element of race, which then helps to reproduce stereotypes about people of colors, histories, and/or supports the claim that no achievement from these communities has been made or are worth teaching. The importance of which is to provide social studies with concrete ways to fully address the teaching of anti-racist curricula, because it will minimize the occurrence of messianic master narratives and teach definitive people of color histories and epistemologies. Much like Dr. Woodson's study that looked at Black youth and how they connect with civil rights movement, Dr. Levy's research shows that students' heritage backgrounds, including race, ethnicity, religion, and nationality, play a crucial role in their emotional connection and interest in histories, specific to those groups with which they identify. Furthermore, the study revealed that students can connect with and understand heritage histories in multiple ways, and that these connections to heritage histories can be enhanced by incorporating them in the classroom, which may encourage students to develop a stronger sense of identity. Like the students mentioned above, Dr. Levy's work is seeking to provide tangible ways the anti-racist curriculum can be used to disrupt the current social studies curricula that more often than not neglect people of color's ways of knowing and their histories. Excluding the important aspects of racism within the social studies curriculum is harmful and dangerous for BIPOCs. Anti-racist social studies education must do more than include a selection of topics to meet the inclusion diversity requirements. It must interrupt the status quo. Not doing so is dangerous. BIPOC's lives depend on it. Racism is violent and traumatic. In order for social studies education to support democratic ideals, the anti-racist curriculum must be melded within the curriculum. So then the social studies curriculum becomes anti-racist. It is not a separate curriculum because the curriculum would already be anti-racist, hence reducing instances of bias and increasing inclusion and diversity. Anti-racist social studies education has more concrete and tangible ways to reduce harm to BIPOC communities and encourage a rich and diverse curriculum for all students, despite the law. Thank you.
Hello, how's everyone doing today? Are we good on the mic levels? So I want you all to think back for just a minute. And when you were a student in school, think about social studies and history. Raise your hand if you had a big, thick book. Big, thick book. I had one of those big, thick books. And every week we hit a chapter and we focused on vocabulary. We had tests at the end of the week and I filled in the right answers. You tried to know the most things that you could from that chapter because we valued how much content you learned. And one of the big things I think is different in my classroom is we don't have a textbook. And go ahead and switch. I want to talk a little about the shift in the pedagogy of teaching. And this is not something I think as a first-year teacher I could have or would have done. But over time, I didn't need that reliance on the textbook. And for many social studies teachers, we're realizing that we're incredibly limited when the text is your major source of information. And there's been a big shift when you think about primary, secondary sources, and really looking at your curriculum of whose voices are missing. What are the different perspectives that we need to have? And it's not a token fill in, let me plug in a lesson here. No. This is throughout all of this is how do we bring in different perspectives and what is the shift? And when you look at this foolish law that we have, this law that we needed apparently, 0 teachers, 0 people have been found to have violated this law at this point. None of them. Because no one is teaching that anyone is inherently inferior or superior to anyone else. But that fear, for newer teachers in particular, I always keep in mind that in the Seacoast, we have an incredibly supportive school board, incredibly supportive superintendent who are focused on equity and what do we need to do, but it is not like that for teachers across our state. And especially for newer teachers, when you're just starting out, the thought that you can be reported to a board and lose your credential, that is where conversations start to back off, because people are concerned, what can I say? And anytime you have silence in critical conversations, you're missing what you really need to be talking about. Go ahead and change. One of the biggest shifts in teaching and social studies is it's less about the content of who knows the most things and how many things do you know and do you know, but it becomes more about thinking. And the concept of critical thinking, everyone often has a question of, well, how do you judge that? How do you see that? And it really is where, as a teacher, you have to, my curriculum changes every year. You look for more and more resources, more perspectives, more pieces to incorporate with it to get kids asking questions. It's not a world where there has to be one right answer anymore. It is about, can you make a claim? Can you support this with multiple pieces of credible evidence? Can you reason through it? And then you get multiple different answers. So the context, of, it always comes up of, well, what if you're teaching the wrong things? To who? To what? It is about students selecting what is it they agree with. How do they make a claim and work through that? And those are the pieces in critical thinking that you want kids to have. It is all about skills and skills that are transferable and not just about specific content pieces. We use SHEG, as they're frequently known, in our professional learning communities at the middle school right over that way. And it's really helped us think about, in all of our different grade levels, 6, 7, and 8, what are the skills that we want our students to have as historians? What are the questions they want to ask? Where do they need to go with this? So I want to show a couple of different pieces so you can see what this looks like in an actual classroom. Go ahead and shift. One of the big pieces we look at is sourcing. Who wrote this? What can we tell is their perspective on this? Look at time frame. When, where, why was it written? And one of these questions that I really want my students to get every year is this reliable? Why or why not? There's so much information. I have kids that live their life on TikTok in 8th grade. They spend a lot of time on TikTok. And there's some fun, there is some great things that can be out there. But when they're looking at these sources for their source of information, I want them to have good digital media skills and to be a citizen and be able to figure out, is this good, is this not good? And the only way they're going to be able to do that is by seeing lots of different pieces of perspectives. Everybody needs to be looking through curriculum and figure out, where are the missing voices? How do I put this in here? How do I give kids the opportunity to see differing viewpoints? It's not about one viewpoint, it's about how many different viewpoints can we offer. Next. Thinking of context. Is it something that is crafted after the fact? It is a primary, or is it a primary source that is crafted in real time? What was different then in time frame of where it may have happened? What was the same? How might the circumstances in which the document was created, how might that affect the content? Those are good historical thinking skills that kids need to have. Go ahead and flip. This becomes a really important one, corroboration. And I think it's one of the ones I see my students struggle with the most sometimes is, again, this is why you need multiple different pieces, because if you only see one thing, you assume that that is it, this is the story. Well, let's look at some other documents. Do they agree with this? Is it something different? Thinking of what are other possible documents that I could look at to see, okay, is this a common theme or is this one isolated viewpoint? And again, asking that question of reliability. What is reliable? How do I know that this is reliable, that I've asked the questions that I need to determine this? Close reading. And when I'm talking about these in critical thinking skills, all of you are doing these every day. When you're looking at the news, when you're hearing stories, these are the questions that we're always asking ourselves. And it really is the deeper piece of thinking. I'll tell you, I have 8th graders sometimes that'll say, why can't we just have a quick test on this? This is hard. Yes, this is hard. Yeah, they'll tell you, this is hard, but this is good. And It's harder to spit out, it's harder to cheat when you really have to think and come up with your evidence, rather than just looking to say, these are the things I needed to know. This is the shift, and it's hard. And I tell kids, sometimes you don't get it right the first time. You may need to go back, but again, we're focused on what are the skills that we want students to have. How do we know when they have them? And when they don't, how do we help them get there? And it may take more time for some than others. But close reading, what are the claims made? Thinking about what is the bias? What language does the author use to persuade? And how do they put a critical lens on that of, do I agree with this? Do I not agree with this? This is all about the skill. Go one more. I don't know if we'll have time. I have some student examples. Switch one more. Oh, go back up. Back one? There. Part of this is off of the screen, and this is a common one that a lot of people are starting to do, of what does critical thinking look like in a student project. So one of the things, and this is one of choices, the nice thing for me as a teacher is when I do an assessment, all the kids don't have to do the same thing. There's different choices of how do they want to show what they know. In this case, in the big screen, they get to create a dinner party, and they choose who's going to be at the dinner party. They're going to choose who sits next to whom. And what are they going to talk about? Real quickly as a teacher, when I see students, they're going to talk about civil rights. Well, like, what about it? Would they agree? Would they disagree? These force kids, first of all, you can't Google and find this. You're really going to have to think about it a little bit. There's no easy way out. But as you go through, in Bayard Rustin and Frederick Douglass, what would they say if they're sitting there? And kids really have to know the background of who is where to know what are they going to talk about. What are they going to agree on? What are they going to disagree about? This is what this can kind of look like in a classroom. And this is one of the stereotypes that I find so hurtful and disheartening when we talk about social studies. When we heard the speech, when I heard people talking about woke indoctrination being one of the greatest changes we need to make in our schools, if by woke you mean that I'm recognizing there are pieces of history that may be missing and that I need to add more and dive deeper, I'll take the woke. I'm fine with that. But somehow, with what we've just talked about, if there's any sense of indoctrinating students, people need to understand how we teach. And we need to provide support for teachers on how to do this if they're not doing this. Don't politicize the content. It's not about that. And this is where every time I see this, this is the fear in a social studies classroom that's keeping the quality conversations that need to happen. This is what's slowing them down. We need more conversation, not less conversation. Thank you.
I don't know how I follow those two. Hi, I'm Sarah Robinson. My work is around following legislation in our state that specifically focuses on public education. So I'm going to give us a quick tour of the divisive concepts law, how we got to this point where we are right now with legislation and potentially where we're going. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you a quick glimpse as to who Granite State Progress is, we are a research and communications hub that focuses on issues of local and statewide importance. Again, I focus specifically on public education, honest education, keeping public education strong, and ensuring that we have healthy classrooms. Next slide, please. So, Divisive Concepts Bill, AKA HB 544, which is how it was introduced, and then was fit into HB 2, the budget trailer bill. Originally, it was filed in 2021, sponsored by these individuals who continue to file legislation that would expand divisive concepts, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There was a huge public outcry to this legislation. It helped that we were in COVID and there was a hybrid option for participating in the legislative process, which is what allowed over 3,000 people to speak out against this bill. and I forget how few there were, but it was probably under 200 people spoke in favor of it. So clearly, from a community-wide, a statewide stance, we do not want laws like this in our state. The bill died on the table during the regular session, which means they just sort of put it away for now. We'll think about that later. That's what that means. And because it was the beginning of the biennium, we were working on the budget process, legislators took the language from HB 544 and inserted it into the budget trailer bill, along with our voucher program. As a result, it did not get its chance on the House floor to be debated or have a roll call vote. So this was snuck in and signed by our governor, who said, I'm not going to sideline a budget just because of one thing that some people don't like. This looks good to me. I'm going to pass it. That's how we have the divisive concepts law now. Next slide, please. Thank you. A quick note that language matters. We've referred to this bill as divisive concepts because of the literal language within statute, and I have a slide of the language. It's small print, you're not gonna read it all, but if you happen to go back to the video later, you can pause or go to the GenCourt website, which has all of our statutes available to us. Activists and advocates for public education have started to use the language of banned concepts instead of divisive concepts, because that's really what we're dealing with. It is a very subtle ban on the way that we allow educators and students to have conversations, and also the way that entities that accept public money are allowed to have those conversations. So organizations that accept state funding, or departments within the state that want to talk about bias or creating nurturing spaces for diversity, they're limited in their speech as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is, like I said, small type. This is the banned concepts law, just for everyone to sort of sit with for a moment. It seems very innocuous on its surface. Of course, we're not going to, vilify a specific protected class. I mean, we have federal laws around that. This was felt, the way that it is written here, almost duplicative if you don't understand the roots of why this language was put into statute in the first place. Of course, we're not going to have racist curriculum. Of course, we're not going to vilify different groups of people. That's not what we do as Americans. It's written into our laws initially. Next slide, please. So the result of this is our educators in public education requested clarity. Okay, we have this divisive concepts law. What am I allowed to talk about? Is this text appropriate? Am I allowed to use these source materials? And I really appreciate Erin's, in your presentation, talking about, I need a lot of voices at the table. This is a nuanced conversation. But for a lot of educators, they're not sure what fits. When they reached out to the Department of Education to ask for clarity, to ask for some ground rules to work within, they received no guidance. And there still is no guidance for educators around how they can avoid persecution as a result of this law. Would you mind? Thank you. So I know I'm going quickly. There's a ton of information here, and I have my email at the end of this. If you would like to have a deeper conversation, that's my bread and butter. I love talking to people. So please reach out. Don't hesitate. The more we have these conversations together, the better this gets for everyone. So our repeal and replace law, also known as HB 61, was heard recently. We had a great turnout of folks who showed up in person. 95% of the folks who testified and signed in at the hearing that day were in favor of a repeal and replace. What the replace would do was it would absolve teachers of any kind of consequence for just doing what we trust them to do for our kiddos every single day, which is teach. As far as the online support, well over 1,000 people signed in support of this law. So it's very clear the public will is to remove this barrier to honest conversation. But I will say, we're at the beginning of a biennium again. We have another budget trailer bill that all kinds of things can get snuck into. We do have an even split on the House floor, just about. I think we have like a 2-person split in favor of the Republicans versus the Democrats. But there's room to work within that split. There's room to have conversations, and so I am hopeful, maybe naively so, that good things can come from this. This does not have its executive session scheduled yet. We think because it is such an important bill and it has caused so many people to turn out. So that is it's to be determined when the committee will be hearing this officially for its executive session and how it gets recommended to the full legislature. Next slide, please. HB 533, relative to public school human rights complaints. This is a very interesting bill. In one of the previous bills I listed, the fact that the Commissioner of Education put on the homepage of the DOE's website a link that would allow families to very swiftly enter complaints to the Commission for Human Rights to tattle on educators. He also has put together a large dossier that you can still go online and find. It's linked through the Department of Education, large collection of hearsay, of redacted text messages and Facebook posts that were used as examples of teachers, not aligning with the divisive concepts law. We also know that the commissioner is fond of Moms for Liberty, which happened to be the group that offered the bounty on teachers. They are still offering $500 to the first family that can find a teacher in violation of the divisive concepts law. So 533 would allow the Department of Education to advance claims of discrimination of human rights violations to the Commission on Human Rights for the state of New Hampshire without the consent of families. They've claimed that they see all kinds of concerns all the time, and that's hearsay for sure. They want to be able to advance those issues for investigation without consent of teachers, districts, the students potentially involved. It is currently, I watched the Judiciary Committee have this conversation. It looks like that dog won't hunt, if you'll pardon the expression. It really, from the Judiciary Committee's standpoint, they asked some really good questions. Specifically, how do you feel about circumventing the rights of families to decide how they experience what happens in their school? How do you justify this right that also no other department in the state has that ability? So they're working on an amendment right now, the DOJ and the DOE. The DOJ did not take a stance on this bill, but they did say that they had significant concerns, as we all did. The rumor on that is that they're looking for the ability of the attorney for the DOE to have subpoena power to be able to call folks out. That does not exist anywhere in our state for any department thus far. I am not aware of the executive session for this either. We can sort of see how these really controversial things they don't get their executive session right away. And we don't find out what bills are going to be heard the following week until Thursday when the legislative calendar comes out. So we're chasing all the time. Next slide, please. HB 219. This is really interesting as well. This is relative to a salary floor for educators. And that doesn't sound too bad at all. Our educators deserve robust, competitive salaries so that we can have the best and brightest teaching our students. This bill, however, only targets 8 districts in our communities. Those districts employ more than one superintendent or a DEIJ coordinator. We only have 4 of those folks in our communities right now. They are all people of color. This bill, the bill's intention is to vilify our DEIJ directors and to make their jobs even harder. This has nothing to do with the pride of teachers. This is specifically based off of a an op-ed that was written by Ryan Terrell, who serves on the State Board of Education. His claim was that public schools in New Hampshire are funded more than enough. They just mismanage their funds by hiring folks who are not teachers. So this bill is essentially that op-ed in LSR form. Just based on the title, you wouldn't know, you would think this is a great idea. I would love a salary floor for teachers. But at the same time, this would circumvent a community's ability to negotiate what they are able to afford for their schools. School funding is a whole other animal, for sure, and is really a barrier to being able to improve. Oh man, I'm at time?
Just about, yep.
How many slides do we have left? 4? And we'll blow through them. Let's just go like rapid fire, rapid succession. New attacks. Anti-CRT is now anti-LGBTQ because anti-racism just wasn't enough for some folks. We needed to start bringing more people into the conversation and vilifying more people. Lots of attempts at book bans across the state. Next slide. I'm trying to go fast. HB 10, establishing a parental bill of rights. Parents have multiple rights in statute. This bill really is created to target LGBTQ kiddos who may potentially use different gender or names at school and outing them to parents before they are ready to share. It's government overreach. Your school does not belong in your conversation between you and your kids. Thank you. When we fight back, we win. Communities have given lots of opportunity to show up for their public schools, and every time the right folks show up and the right message is met. So with our collective energy, we can change these things. Next slide, please. And this is how you do it. You run for office. You run for your... You join your local PTA. You show up in spaces where we need these conversations to happen, and you are willing to hold the space for it. Go onto the Gen Court website, learn about these bills. There's many more that I could have told you about that are working to expand divisive concepts. They don't care really what we're teaching. They care that we're teaching at all. Public education is at risk, and it is our job to support it and defend it. And support your district's DEIJ director. They are human beings doing difficult work, trying to change the system that employs them. Ask them what they need and how you can be there to support their work. I think that's it.
Wow, what a great panel. And before we turn to our conversation, I'm going to bring up Michelle Dillon, who's going to do our community norms. And then we're going to have a chance for you all to get together in groups and talk about a couple questions before we go to the overall question answer. So, Michelle, come on up.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Holt-Shannon. I'm with New Hampshire Listens. And all good. I'll answer. David. I answer to all kinds of names. We have this beautiful group of folks in this room. There's folks in an overflow room upstairs, and we have a ton of people online. And so when the time comes, I'm going to be running the mic. I can get around, and I'm also going to stop here and get questions from folks online. So a couple of things we will ask. Please be respectful and use respectful language. These are always contested spaces, and it's just really good to dig in and have the conversations that we know we need and want to have. Mm-hmm. Please wait for me to get to you and use the microphone, because otherwise nobody else can hear you. So we definitely want to have our friends online be able to hear. Listen generously to learn. Please don't interrupt. Share airtime and be crisp with your questions. We really want to get back to our awesome panelists and hear even more from them. So we'll be asking you to get to your questions. And just please be mindful that good intentions can still sometimes have a harmful impact. And if someone shares a story and you really want to tell it, please ask for their permission. Otherwise, your learning leaves here. We hope you talk about it, and the stories that someone else shares can stay. So, David, back to you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Michelle. And so we're going to put a couple of questions up on the screen for the folks here and online. And we thought we'd take 5 minutes for you to turn to your neighbors, maybe in groups 2, 3, and 4. And yeah, what was your experience in school with an African American curriculum? And what do you think students should learn today? So I guess we're going to get those back up. And so why don't people maybe gather in twos or threes to talk about this? You can start on that first question about what was your experience in school on African American curriculum. So.
About 2 more minutes. We'll do the hands. All right. Thank you all. Okay. So we're going to start with a couple of questions from our online community, and then I will do some running around in this room as well.
It's very important.
Okay, here's our first question.
So we have a question from the chat. What do people mean, and this goes for all of our presenters, what do people mean by the term woke / those woke liberals?
Good to be woke. I'm good with that.
I don't know. Who wants to take that?
Well, let me just start for a second, because I think it would be really important for people to look back into how that term woke has been kind of co-opted from some use, but maybe not a whole lot in the African American community, to be a derisive label for critical race theory. And critical race theory arose out of a law school practice 30, 40 years ago as a way of looking as critical legal theory, which is critical legal theory began to look at how law actually affected people's lives, and then it was taken to the next step of saying critical race theory in that tradition. How do we look at that as to the actual effects of law and legal structures on race in this country? And that, that was something that was a very important innovation in legal teaching, and then certainly was seen as an effective way, particularly after Black Lives Matter, looking at the ways in which institutions actually understood and individuals understood the structures they were in and how they might have promulgated some of these racial bias and racial inequalities. But then you can see what has happened since then. So that is a little bit of the background about it, and I don't know if my panelists now have had time to think about what they want to say.
I think this is all sort of based in, like, one of the slides that I presented, language matters, right? And so there are folks who are very skilled at taking language and using it as a weapon as opposed to a way to bring folks together. I consider the term woke to mean awake to the things that are happening around us, an awareness of how other people's lives are affected by my experience in the world and how we are deeply interconnected. But that has been co-opted by the far right to be used to create a narrative about government schools, which is something you hear a lot in the news and in certain rhetoric, or indoctrination. It's all methodology to try and stop what is inevitable, right? The moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a matter of time. And white supremacy is a disease. It's a virus, and it will hang on as hard as it can and try to stay. So this language really is a gasping and a grasping to the status quo. And so I figure if they're using that language in a weaponized way, I think we're on a good path.
Maybe our next question, Michelle?
One more question from the chat. What is the best way to follow or find out more information on bills going through our legislative?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that too. I don't mean to dominate the mic. Feel free to reach out to me. It's Sarah, SARAH, at granitestateprogress.org. There is a coalition of folks working together to protect public education in our state. Many different folks who focus on different aspects of public education. But your best tool is the Gen Court website. If you Google New Hampshire General Court, it will take you to the website where you can search for specific bills based on the text in the bill or the title or the number. But connecting with advocates and organizations that focus on this stuff, our job is to understand the law and abbreviate it for you and make it tangible so that you can talk about it. So I would say reach out to the folks doing the work. I'm happy to put you in contact with anyone and everyone.
Ask your senator or your legislator.
That's true too. Ask your representatives.
So we're going to go one up front here, Michelle. We'll turn to the audience. And thank you.
My question is, what is the purpose of these bills? The very base purpose, is it just that all these people are racist that want these bills passed? Why, what is the basic of it? It just seems absurd, but.
Well, this is part of what I like to call an ugly sweater of privatization. The goal is to make public education the space of last resort for families. And if you can create toxic environments, if you can pull funding out of that system, like through our voucher programs, if you can create as much hostility within a space as possible, people are going to leave. And so this isn't really, I mean, yes, it is about white supremacy and racism, but it is part of a bigger attempt to end public education. It's the only place left where people of all different races and socioeconomic experiences go and cheer on each other's kids. That's a powerful thing, and it is difficult to manipulate people with that experience. So that's what this all is about, is that we're teaching at all.
I wonder, Judy, would you be able to talk a little bit about, because you certainly talk with parents, and Erin, you do as well, about, you know, people have a lot of anxieties about their children and about the schools. And what do you see, Judy, in terms of the concerns people have about, you know, about our curriculum and about the way our schools are functioning?
Well, I think that America is becoming truly diverse, and you can't continue to teach the old things anymore because students are catching on. They're like, this doesn't make any sense. How is this still true? So that means because social studies is a living thing, you need to, it pushes you to look at your space and say, how can I make this reality come true for you as I'm teaching you this stuff, right? I think it's fear. I think, yes, part of anti-racism is making sure that the oppressed groups feel seen, but the other side to that is questioning whiteness, right? You'd have to really look at yourself. Toni Morrison, in an interview, she spoke eloquently about that. She said, you would have to really look at yourself and wonder, why do I behave the way I do? Why do I think the way I do? Why do I fear this? Difference is good. It's important. Challenges are good. Conflict is good because it teaches you not to be complacent, but it also teaches you to rise above and gives you different perspectives. And so if you want to keep America as it was, or is, then you would need to make sure that you're teaching your students now, or your children now, to think a certain way, right? So it's I don't know, I hope that answers your question. It's just fear, I think.
This is, I guess, directed at you, Erin, and that is just to applaud. I'm a teacher of history as well at the high school level. I have been for 40 years. And what your characterization of how we teach history is spot on. My question is, do you find that you and others, your colleagues around in your district, are inviting students to critically examine the divisive concepts law itself?
I think with 8th graders, I don't know that I've really pulled it out. I have mentioned in one of the classes and talked about if at any point anyone feels that they're inherently superior or inferior, we can, we'll talk about it. But I'm like, I do think, and do the question up here as well, there's the concept, it frustrates me that we're using fear. And we're also using fear of change, that this concept, if it was good enough for me back in the day, this is how we learned, why do we need to change this? And I think you do have to look critically as an educator to, I don't know, I look back 15, 20 years, and I have evolved as an educator. I'm like, ooh, probably missed the mark with that. What can I do to make this better? If you don't have that critical reflection of your own practices and what are you teaching, how are you teaching, where do we need to go, who's missing, you're missing all of these opportunities of evolving. Every year, I really do hope, I can't imagine being a teacher that every year it looks exactly the same. Like, okay, let's pull out this lesson. It's a dialogue, and it's going on with our students every day of you have to look and shift to how does this connect to their present day life. And as history changes, even in the past few weeks with Tyree Nichols talking about that, what does that look like? If you can't connect history to the present, with 8th graders, you're going to lose them every time. It's taking, here's what you know now, let's see how we connect this. And that's going to change every single year, every single day of weaving this in. What do we know in these cycles of history? But I think it's about, with kids, being honest and open. And if you're going to have an honest conversation, I can't tell you exactly what we're going to do and finish for the day because it may change based on this conversation. You have to evolve live time, quick, on your feet to make it authentic for them. It's not about what I want to tell them, it's about what they want to tell me.
So, my question, though, begins with a comment and an appreciation. Thank you, all the educators, for sticking with public education and just being there every day for our children and our parents. Yay. I started my career in a classroom in the 1970s, a long time ago. It's nothing like what you live through today, and I just really admire and respect and thank you. So the question I have is, how should we respond to efforts to ban key literary works in the Black canon? So, for example, Ibram Kendi's work, Eddie Glaude's work, Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, Claudia Rankin's work, Toni Morrison's work, all of them on the chopping block right now for what is appropriate in a classroom. Of course, anytime you ban something for teenagers, they're going to find it. So we got that.
I mean, you're the educators. You want to chat?
I was so disappointed hearing about the College Board's decision to alter their African American curriculum class after what Florida said. It was heartbreaking, that we're bending to this rather than, really seeing, well, what are the contents? Is this something, why is this being shifted on one state? That's tough. But I think that's, as you said, first of all, as soon as you ban something, kids want it, which can be a great thing. I feel at this point, and in Portsmouth and teaching, we have a real degree of flexibility to work with our professional learning communities and say, what are we using? Let's think about, does this fit? Is this making sense? We have a great group of people that are working together with this. My fear is that, again, my experience here in Portsmouth is not, you drive 20 minutes in a different direction. We have teachers that school board members are going after them specifically in their curriculum. And that's, I think, for that question, it's different, it may be different based on where you're at. As educators, you need to look deep, and what are the voices and perspectives that we need with this? And considering the age of your students and where they're at. Obviously, there are different conversations held at different levels based on the age of students. And for students that are choosing to take an AP class in African American culture and history is different than what we have our general survey courses. So when students are seeking to dive deeper, to say that we're going to cut back on what you have access to, it's very disheartening to see.
If I may just add something as well, to go back to Carter G. Woodson's words, that it's not so much these individual titles that are attacked, but the baseline, the base here is how little of African American history is actually in the curriculum at all, and how it is not seen as, Woodson says, American history. And I see you back there, Jerry Ann, and I know how many decades you worked to have Harriet Wilson's work included in the schools. You got a statue put up in Milford, and yet is that book a foundational text of African-American literature, first novel written by an African-American, published by an African-American woman, and she is New Hampshire. And is it being taught? I see no. So, this is, I think, the deeper issue is that the illusion that somehow the curriculum has been taken over or somehow disrupted or distorted by this curriculum, when really it's not much there at all. And these individual books then become a convenient target for making an argument against having any kind of this inclusive education. And I just think back, Judy, if you don't mind my, kind of turning it back to you, is that you said something I think very profound at the beginning when you said that social studies is about citizenship. It's about being civic-minded. It's about democratic inclusion. And I wonder if you think that concept of civics and citizenship is really what's being contested now, that it is about inclusion.
Yeah, it's a certain type of citizen that they want. Right? But to address, right? Yeah. One that doesn't critically think. But I want to answer your question. I would be interested to see a nationwide ban on books that include the N-word, because I know that some teachers, it's like they enjoy reading these books, and it's written in the book, so I'm going to have to say it. It's like an excuse. Those authors that you mentioned, what they're doing in their work, Coates, Morrison, Kendi, all of those people, they're showing you what racism does to Black, Indigenous people of color. And that's a different perspective. And so if you're a student, maybe you're not explicitly taught racism at home, right? Maybe your mom says, you treat, or your parents tell you to treat others kindly. And so you're sitting in the classroom and you listen to this like, wait, what is this? So you start asking more questions. Now that is a critical thinker. That's the type of citizen who is going to push democratic ideals, right? And that's what the National Council of Social Studies, that's what they're saying. That's what social studies, the field is. Yes, so I hope that answers.
Michelle?
Yes. Back to our online friends.
Okay, so we have another question from the chat. This one's a bit of a long one, but I think it's important. The Civil Rights Act requires recipients of federal funding to be aware of discrimination as it occurs in the U.S., and it bans discriminatory practices by contractors and vendors or federal funding recipients. Yet the ban concept law prohibits educating about traditional long-standing history of discrimination. So is the ban concept law in conflict with the Civil Rights Act, and shouldn't federal statute take precedent?
So that law is actually the subject of a lawsuit right now, and it has been granted a hearing. The basis of the hearing is the vagueness of the law, not if it conflicts with federal law. But there's a multiple, New Hampshire was the 15th state to institute a divisive concepts law in the country. And all of those states are coming forward with these lawsuits, and they're all getting through in the same way, this vagueness clause. Like, you're not giving us any guidance as to how we're supposed to implement this law. I agree. It is, the way this question is written, it does violate federal law, but it is being taken to task, which I'm very grateful for, and I'm grateful to Tina Philibot and Andres Mejia, who are both DEIJ directors, who are part of that lawsuit, the NEA, AFT, and the ACLU. So keep an eye on the news; it's coming. They're doing God's work.
Truly.
Some more questions. Go in there and then over here.
Sorry,
okay?
Over there. So this is, I'll start off with a joke because I think it's kind of funny. So Erin, Erin, you, the acronym for the Stanford History
Shag.
Educational, SHAG.
Yes.
In Jamaican, shag up means it's messed up. So our system is really messed up. You understand, right, Judy?
I do.
So my question is, somebody asked about why this is important, and I'm thinking there is as a capitalist society, there is a monetary value to keeping our students from being critical thinkers. Do you think that way?
Yes.
Please expand.
Well, that's how capitalism works. Like, you need folks at the bottom to be workers, and then the very few at the top. They're the ones who are the managers. I would say, I'm choosing my words carefully. I would say this, that when we think about like schools in general, right? So you have some schools who aren't affected by this divisive concepts law. They're gonna teach codes. Morrison is in there. Those students are getting they're educated, okay? They're gonna go on to be the managers. They're gonna go on and own things, right? They're gonna know the language. See where I'm going? Yep. So those in public education, as Sarah pointed out, if the bigger goal, yes, racism and white supremacy, yes to that, right? Yes. However, if the bigger goal is to defund it, to cripple it, then you have a bunch of workers. You have a bunch of people who are just mindless citizens who are just gonna be easily manipulated to do what you want.
If I may respond to Jerry Ann's question briefly too, is that, as a historian, I think go back to the Declaration of Independence, the first draft, and look what Jefferson had written when he took John Locke's words, life, liberty, and property. And he knew that was a problem because if you said people had a right to property, they had a right to property in their own bodies, and that would include women and enslaved people. So he changed it to pursuit of happiness. But which is, it's an interesting, and that was an important term too,
Yeah.
in terms of what that meant, because that was sociable and a society and its health as a whole. But then the other thing he did is he had inherent rights in the first draft, and he changed that to unalienable because he recognized the problem with inherent was that was something that was socially determined by classes that were in power. And I think that what it suggests is, even from the founding of the Republic, that question about who owns our culture, who owns the public space, who owns education, was something that was going to be highly contested. And here we are again. Whose country is this, and whose economy is this? Who owns it? And I think that is kind of what's also at the root of Judy's answer too.
I'm actually from Portland, Maine, and I'm very impressed with this panel, I have to say. But I'm the parent of a 7th grader, and my daughter came home from school last year telling me about the Taino Indians and why we call it Indigenous Peoples Day, and this was really exciting to me, who grew up, with Columbus Day and that mythology. And so I'm an excited parent by this and by this shift that you were talking about, but not all parents are. So I'm wondering, from the educator and the educator of educators, what do you do with those parents? Like, how do you bring them along, or do you even try?
I think there's a fear about the unknown of what we teach and what we don't teach. And post-COVID, I think our curriculum, our resources, what we do is probably more accessible than it's ever been. We have weekly playlists that all of my activities are posted on. So it's great when kids are absent. They can see exactly what we've done. And parents can see that as well. And it goes back to the concept of woke indoctrination. That is used to inspire fear among people of the unknown. And they don't want to know what they don't know, because then you have to adjust your thinking. It's easier to remain back. Well, I don't know. What could they be doing? And I think it's my issue too with this bill of, you mentioned the word inherent. I think one of the biggest things that I get concerned coming in conflict with this bill is discussions on systemic racism. What is inherent? That, I think you got to be careful. And you have to hope, I'd say 85 to 90% of my parents are so good and supportive. And sometimes I have to remind myself in the bigger picture of things that 5-10%, that make you feel really uncomfortable is not the feeling of most of them. And I invite parents, if you want to see what I'm doing, if what you're concerned with, come and take a look. Sadly, in New Hampshire, parents can excuse their children from any curriculum. It's state law even before this. So again, it's not required to teach social studies until 8th grade, which is just beyond me. But I don't understand, again, why we needed this law, because honestly, if parents are concerned, you can remove your child from that. You know, there's a choice. So I think it's easier. I think people sometimes choose to stay with that fear of what this could be rather than see the reality of what is. And, you know, as I've done this for 24 years, 26 out in California, for newer teachers, that's who I want to partner with. That's who we want to have strong professional learning communities so that you can share, because I couldn't have done the work the way I do it now when I first started out. So, you know, encourage your students, teachers, support them. You know, it's really hard because sometimes we do get stuck with a couple voices, and you just have to remember the perspective of how big this is.
So Judy, how, you know, there you are in Manchester schools, which, you know, I really think Manchester is the hope of New Hampshire's future. The diversity there and the extraordinary teachers there, and now you're there, you know? And so I'm just, you know, how's it going? You know, how you're you're dealing with these parents, you're dealing with fellow educators, with the aldermen, everybody else, you know, so how is it on this this question about what do you bring parents along?
I don't know. It's one of those things I wrestle with personally. Do I want to change people's hearts and minds? Like, do I want to convince you that I'm worth learning about my histories, my people? I'm from the Caribbean, so the Taino is close to my heart as well. I don't know. I wrestle with that. So I don't have an answer for that directly. But in terms of my position, the Equity Inclusion Project Manager, I think educators want to do it. They want to talk about these different things, at least the ones that I've met. I've only been there since October of last year. But they're afraid, they're nervous, they don't want to lose their job. This is their livelihood, right? So I've been very creative in how, for example, I believe it was November or December, I helped to create a curriculum for MLK, and I really had to dive deep into the standards because I needed the standards as a support, as evidence as to why it's okay to teach it. Like, you have the standards here to support you, and this is your cover, you know, if you will. And it was still a little shaky, you know. I had to go through the lawyers and et cetera, et cetera. So it did get through, but I had to do some work. I had to really make sure I aligned the standards to this. What does that mean for students? What if it didn't go through? That meant that they would have missed out on learning different aspect of MLK's speech that needed to be taught. A perspective for all students. For all students. Yes, I'm Black, and I'm going to speak from that experience, but all students benefit from this, all of them. So that's what I would say.
Well, thank you so much. And we don't, that's the end of our questions, and we're going to have a wrap up in just a moment. But I can't have two teachers up here without saying, you read any good books lately? What would you want to recommend? How about it, Erin? You want to recommend a book, and then Judy, one book you think people might like reading?
Oh my gosh, there's so many.
You get one.
That's what's hard. You're making me choose. You know, why are all the Black kids in the cafeteria sitting together? Like that, it's an easy place to start of let's start looking critically. Let's start figuring this out and diving deep. That is a good place to start. But there's so many.
I know, Judy.
It's rough.
Oh man, so I'm wrapped up in my literature review for schools. I'm just reading that kind of stuff, but I forget the author's name. I think the last name is Zabi, but the title is White Teeth. Oh,
Zadie Smith. Zadie Smith. Yeah. Great book.
Great book.
Yeah.
Recommend this one.
White Teeth.
Reading.
White
Yes.
Teeth. And all of her work, really.
Yes.
She's really something.
She is.
Well, thank you so much to our panel once again. And now Carolyn's going to come up to wrap us up. Oh, and lots of cookies left over there too, by the way, on your way out.
Some for the road. Thank you.
Wow. I just say, bringing it back, conversations we still need. When Anne started this program today, I was thinking, and she said, we'll have this conversation for the next 5 weeks and forever and ever. And I was saying, no, this is only going to go for another year or so. But, panel, you've shown us, you've told us that this is ongoing, and we all have to stay on top of it because it's not something that is going to end in the next year. And I think with what you've shared with us today, we've been given some tools. And I take, wow, so many pearls today. And I'm only given a few minutes, so if I might, can I share just a few that I'm taking away, and I think you will also. Wow, Judy, you said the law places restrictions, and then by default, it already promotes the dominant narrative. And how do we get around that? What do we share with our students? One way to improve anti-racist education is to connect heritage histories to develop a stronger sense of students and themselves. Erin, the shift in pedagogy of teaching, that was a big one, and that's something I've been hearing a lot on the outside as well. One of the things you said that stood out to me was silence in critical conversation. If there's silence, you're already missing what you should be talking about. The other thing that stood out is something that I think we can all use in our lives. Teach skills and not just specific content. You had a number of slides that spoke to that. I'm going to remember that. Sarah, you just had so many things. No, it's a good thing. Nope. I'll just be general then. Go to the website, particularly Google New Hampshire General Court. You also gave your website, your email information, which I'm sure has been put in the chat. So that's going to be helpful to all of us. And then I was thinking, it's a little corny, but what came to me was some of the lyrics of Whitney Houston's song, The Greatest. I printed it out, and just a few of the sentences. And if we all did that, and particularly our teachers and our family and everyone who's responsible for the lives of children. She said, I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Let's start there.